If you're watching this on YouTube and aren't subscribed, make sure and click the subscribe button, like, comment, let us know what you think about the episode. If there's a particular guest or topic that you like to hear about, I love to be able to take your comments and then get them on to future episodes, which is exactly where today's came from. Somebody asked, is it safe to tow with a tuned truck? How do I know I won't destroy an engine, melt a turbo down, something like that? So I'm going to be joined by Jacob from Edge, and I want to kind of take a deep dive into how they develop tuning, how they test it both on a dyno and then real world applications. And ask him the question, is it safe to tow with a tuned truck? So I'm looking forward to chatting with him today. Before we get to it, I want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors that helps make the Diesel Podcast possible. Kershaw Knives has a 40% off MSRP code for you. If you go to kershaw.kaiusa.com, use code 25TDP40. That gets you 40% off MSRP, and they've got a ton of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, handle design, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet a wide variety of budgets. So if you're in the market, head on over to their website and use code 25TDP40. All right, let's get to today's podcast with Jacob from Edge and asking, is it safe to tow with a tuned truck? Jacob, welcome back to the Diesel Podcast. How you been?
Good. I appreciate the invite again. I was afraid that after that first one, I might not hear from you again. But
it was really
here
cool.
we are, so I appreciate it.
I really enjoyed that last one and going through the history of Edge and then where Edge is now here in 2025. I think we chatted right before the end of the year last year.
Yeah.
But it's so integral to what diesel performance, how it started and then where it's going. And I was just mentioning right before the podcast that I just had a conversation with Stainless Diesel, and your guys' products popped up again, and we were talking about some second gen stuff, and so I know there's a lot of new things that you guys are working on. One of the huge ones that we get, I got a question not long ago about this very topic, was about towing and then adding power.
Yeah.
And like specifically with like newer trucks, but I think what we're talking about is going to apply towards older ones as well. But the listener was really curious about adding 100 horsepower, 120, 130, something like that, and what that can do long term. What about when towing? What should they do? So I know we're going to have a really good conversation, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to dive into some of that stuff. I mean, obviously, that's what these trucks were built for. That's why guys are buying 3/4 ton and 1 ton trucks. Diesel motors, they like the horsepower. They like that low end torque. We know that core consumer is using that truck for towing, and we try and cater our products specific to that. So obviously, there's a fine line that has to be walked between when too much is too much. And we try and toe that mark the best we can so that these trucks can run more efficient, be more enjoyable to drive, and then hopefully increase the usability of that vehicle without affecting the long-term longevity. So
maybe we start with that fine line, because I think that's going to be where most people are really curious. And I know it's going to vary based on truck, but maybe we start there as how much power can be too much? What should I pay attention to? Is it just EGTs? What should I look for to make sure I'm not towing with too much power and going to damage the engine, the turbo? There's lots of transmissions.
Sure.
There's lots of things that can break.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, going back to the beginning, when this all kind of started, what is too much? Like you mentioned, it does vary drastically depending on which specific truck you're driving. 15 years ago, these trucks, we had lots of issues with transmissions in these trucks. We could usually make more power and torque with the engines and still be well under that engine's threshold in a stock application before we had any issues with the engine. It was usually the transmission that was the weak link. The early Allisons and the LB7 trucks, it was pretty easy to get to 450, 500 horsepower with just tuning, not having to change the turbocharger or fuel system, with the performance tuning, get up into that 450, 500 horse range. And those trucks would start having issues with, their fifth gear, the overdrive in those early 5-speeds have issues holding, and they'll slip and run into a limp mode and leave you coasting down the side of the freeway at 80 miles an hour with no gears, So that was always kind of the limitation in like those older LB7s. The same with the older second gens and even some of the third gen Dodges. The transmission always seemed to be what held us back. But move forward into today's late model trucks, the newest stuff, you rarely hear of guys having issues with the 6-speed and even now the 10-speed transmissions in the Powerstrokes. Those transmissions are rock solid, and those trucks can make 650 horsepower. And these guys aren't even touching those transmissions yet, so it really depends on the application. But we try and cater our tuning modules to the core consumer that's using that truck as a daily driver. We don't necessarily cater to the high performance applications. We do have some products that will speak specifically to those guys depending on the application, but the core of our market consumer is that entry level guy that's just bought a diesel pickup, and there's a couple of things that he doesn't like about it. He's looking for better throttle response, a little better turbo spool up. Our products are catered more to that average diesel truck owner that wants just a little bit more, and to be able to enjoy that drive or towing across country, get a little bit more low end performance, accelerating from a light with 15,000 pounds in tow. That kind of consumer. So our calibrations are run through our emissions cell so that we meet 49 state compliance. A lot of our products go forward into to SEMA Garage or to CARB to get an EO document. But all of those calibrations are thoroughly tested so that we know that they work really well in a stock application. And that's kind of who our core consumer is. And we try to cater to that and keep in mind that we don't want to blow our truck up on the side of the road, and we know our customer doesn't either. So,
right. Would you say that, where, like you mentioned, the LV7, second, third gens, it was the transmission that would fail, and that would sort of dictate what options somebody would have kind of out of the box. Now, is it more the emission system, specifically the DPF, that is you're getting? That's kind of the fine line, is how far can we take it before, to prevent that from clogging or being an issue?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the emissions compliance is a big thing for our company, for our brand. And so, we got to make sure we're keeping in line with what those emission systems are capable of. We monitor regen status, we monitor soot accumulation, we check all that stuff when we're in development of new tuning or new calibrations, and we try to fall in to where we're not going to add any additional stress or durability issues with the EGR coolers and the flow that can go through those. We try to stay within the factory limitations of the factory equipment, and that goes for the turbochargers, the EGR systems, the DPF. I mean, that's absolutely a limitation to what these trucks' potential are. But it has gotten better as time has gone on as well. What the aftermarket performance that you can get out of a brand new 10-speed Powerstroke is completely different than what we could do in a 0864. You know what I mean? The OEMs have made huge improvements in the emissions systems themselves, to the point that we can add pretty major horsepower improvements to those trucks without really having any issues or long-term problems with the emissions equipment. So
do you think that's been part of, I don't want to say it's a misconception because there was truth to it, but we take those early 2008 to 10, maybe 12, I guess it depends on the brand truck we're talking about.
Yeah.
But the perception was emissions on tuning, you're not going to get that much power. Are you really going to feel, this particular power number in a 7,000 pound, 8,000 pound truck? Probably not. So I'm not going to invest the money. Versus say a 2020, a 2019, 2021, these guys that are just coming out of warranty and they're like, okay, now I want to do stuff to it. Yeah. Where you can increase that power and get gains that would probably surprise people, what you can do on these newer systems because the OEM technology has progressed and because it gives Edge more ability to be able to deliver that power and that torque.
Yeah, I mean, yes, most definitely the OE's technology improvements have definitely helped what we're capable of as well. We can get 60, 70 horsepower gains out of some of those early DPF equipped trucks and still feel that those calibrations are going to be safe on that equipment. The downside now is that some of those trucks are 10, 15 years old. Yeah. And the emissions equipment it was never designed or developed to have that kind of a lifespan. So as those trucks are getting up into the 150, 200, 250,000 mile thresholds, you're seeing that emissions equipment fail, whether the truck's tuned or not. They just weren't designed for that kind of a life cycle. But, with these late model trucks, we can absolutely get quite a bit more power out of them. And it's not just the emissions equipment stuff that's led to that. I mean, the OE's changing in the way the fuel systems work, changing to the CP4s with the higher atomization rates, the higher rail pressures, the changes that they've made to the injectors themselves. All of that fuel system technology has really helped because we get a better atomization, a cleaner burn. We can control the cylinder pressures differently. We can control the way the injector fires when it opens the pilot injection versus the main injection. There's so many different things that we can work with now to kind of control how those calibrations work and how the engine works under load. And there's also a lot more data monitoring on those trucks, factory data monitoring stuff. Mass airflow systems have improved drastically through the years. The limitations of the rail pressure systems, all that kind of stuff is things that we lean on. The advancements in the OE's technology definitely allows us to do more in the aftermarket side of it. And we're seeing great results in keeping all of that emissions compliant stuff going. You back in the days, we've got our comp box in a second gen truck that can pick up like 180 horsepower in a stock truck, even with the factory injectors. 180 horsepower and 400 torque over factory with just tuning. We used to be able to get really big gains in some of those trucks. And so today we may not see those large of gains, but we're also starting at a much higher floor. A brand new Dodge Cummins makes a heck of a lot more power and torque than it did 20 years ago. Yeah. So, we can still reach that 450, 500 horsepower mark with these trucks in all stock form and just adding a simple plug and play module like our EZX or our Evolution CTS3 flash tuner, like the 20 and 21 Ford Powerstrokes. Those trucks are using a locked ECM that didn't look like it was going to be able to be unlocked and flashed. So when those first hit the market, we came out strong with our EZX platform. That's a plug and play module that piggybacks under the hood, just like our old school EZ modules did 20 years ago in the 5.9 Cumminses. Pick up 60 to 65 horsepower in that Powerstroke and tap into the pedal for better throttle response. And then there's an app that allows you to control features like tire size and TPMS settings, that kind of stuff. And it was a great seller for us. And we were afraid that was going to be the only thing we could offer for those trucks due to the locked ECM. But our engineers were able to work through that ECM and the coding, and we were able to use our locksmith technology to unlock that ECM. So now we have our Evolution CTS3 available for that same truck, the 20 to 21 trucks. And that Evolution is emissions compliant and will pick up 143 peak horsepower over stock. So, the sky's the limit. We can make over 500 horsepower, keep all of the factory Ford emissions equipment under the hood. You can daily drive it and turn it down to a lower level and tow your trailer anywhere you want to go with it. So
I love transmissions. I love talking about them, and it's been something for years and years. I don't know why. It's one of the parts of a truck I really love. So it's funny you had mentioned the capability of the stock transmissions, and this is going to show that I'm like a Ram Cummins guy, because I would always think, and it was like this forever, it was like, well, how much can my stock transmission handle? That's what's going to limit what I can do with tuning.
That does tell me you're a Dodge guy.
It does. Yeah. I knew that would kind of tip my hand right there. And I was always envious of like Duramax owners, whether it's a 5 or 6 speed, and you do a triple disc converter, some C1 to C5 clutches, some A and B trim valves, you're good to like 750, 800 horsepower. The Ford guys, like the 6.4s, even the 6.0s and that 5R was great because you make 650 on a stock transmission, where you have a Cummins, you're probably looking at building it at 450. And then depending, where you want to take it, you're getting into billet shafts and things like that. But with the capability of these 10 speeds, I know we don't know a whole lot about the 8 speed that the Ram's getting, but it's so nice to, I guess, feel comfortable that if I want to add this kind of power, I'm not immediately jumping into a $5,000 to $8,000 transmission setup so I can enjoy this truck and the power and the torque along with it.
Yeah. And, like our EZX line for that 19 to 24 Cummins, it works in the standard and the high output. And it's not going to set the world on fire with 150 horsepower gains, but it makes enough power that that it's not stock anymore. And if that truck is equipped with one of the ASIN trans, that transmission is rock solid, and it's pretty hard to hurt one, right? you can tow whatever you want, but daily driving a truck with that transmission, like it reminds me of driving a school bus. There's so much defuel in that 1-2 shift that driving around town, it's just not a lot of fun. They feel kind of lazy and lethargic. And an EZX module can completely change that drivability and that feeling. I've always been a Ford guy, but we definitely have an uphill battle marketing our products, our performance modules to the Ford guys versus the Cummins guys. And, if you drive both of those brand new trucks, a 2022 Ford Powerstroke or Duramax or Cummins, they all have a little bit different driving experience. And we try to fine tune to make it more enjoyable and more useful with whichever module or flash tuning that we're releasing. Each one of those trucks has a weak point, in our opinion, in how they drive and how it feels from the driver's seat. And so we try and capitalize on those weak points and make the weak points disappear, basically. You know what I mean? So, a simple plug and play module like that EZX in a new Cummins can completely change the way that truck drives. We get feedback that, man, I plugged this in and it fixed everything I hated about this brand new truck. And that's the kind of feedback that we strive to get from owners. You know what I mean? You're spending a lot of money on these brand new trucks and you're not completely content with it. What can we do to make that better? You know what I mean? And so those are the things that we try and pinpoint, and how can we improve the user experience? And that's kind of where we try and hit it out of the park with feature ads and smartphone interaction and different features. It's not just about making power anymore. It's about improving the entire driving experience. 20 years ago, that was the number one thing, that I need more power so I can maintain 70 with my fifth wheel over the grade. You know what I mean? And now these trucks make so much power from the factory that's not as big as a demand anymore. That doesn't mean we can't and that people don't want it if it's available. I think that will always be the case. Any guy that says he doesn't want more power, I don't think it is in the right market here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Once you drive one with more, you're definitely going to want it. You know what I mean? So the market definitely shifts and changes, and we try to do our best to keep up. So
I definitely want to ask you about testing R&D, with towing and adding power here in a second. But I wanted to spend a little time on what you just mentioned, because there's a lot of questions that we get in conversations that I hear where somebody's looking at buying a truck that's 2 or 3 years old, and they're not focused in on a particular brand. Like, you'd probably look at a Powerstroke. I'm probably going to look at a Ram. So they're kind of open to either one. But they say, okay, what is the experience of driving it? And then immediately after that is, how can I improve it? So I wanted to ask you, you're spending some time with these trucks. If you were to take a 2022, 2023, 2021, something kind of in that range, we were to look at Powerstroke, an L5P, a 6.7 Cummins. Let's start with the Powerstroke. What would you say are some of the driving behavior stock that you would want more? And then how does Edge change that or improve it for that particular truck owner? And then we'll go through the Duramax and Cummins.
So in the Ford application, a lot of the things that kind of bother me as a driver are some of the features that are built into the truck, some of the way that Ford laid some of the things out. That 10-speed made it it was a game changer. I mean, the 6-speed transmissions were awesome. And I personally drive a 17 F350 with the 6-speed. And I love that truck. I really enjoy driving that truck. But the 10-speed makes it a whole different ballgame. And those trucks are making crazy power stock. And so it's very rare that you get into one of those trucks and think, man, I need more power. This thing just doesn't have enough power, because they feel like rocket ships compared to trucks five years older. You know what I mean? But there are things, that new Super Duty platform, it's pretty common for those guys to slap some 35-inch tires underneath them. You put a leveling kit on it and they'll fit 37s. You don't have to change anything. So one of the big things that we saw there is that for these guys that are just putting 37-inch tires on the trucks, the factory ECM will only accept up to a 34.5-inch tire. So the speedometer never reads correctly. So with our EZX line of module, because of the way we're on the CAN bus system in that vehicle, we can intercept that signal, and we can actually calibrate up to a 50-inch tire on those trucks. So if you're putting 37s on one of those trucks, our EZX will allow you to calibrate the speedometer to be dead on at 75 miles an hour with a 37-inch tire. So features like that, we can adjust the TPMS settings. Some of those trucks, Ford has the TPMS threshold set really high. They want you to run 70 psi or more in your rear tires. A lot of these guys go to their aftermarket wheels and tires. There's no need to run that high of pressure, especially if they're not towing. And so they want to run the pressure, drop the pressure down, but they're going to have a light on the dash. So, we have the ability to adjust that threshold. So you can set it at 45 psi, or you can disable it altogether. If you don't want to put TPMS sensors in your new wheels and tires, our modules will allow you to just disable that. But from a driving situation, like the 20 to 21, we talked about that evolution tuner. We do have the ability to tune that 10-speed trans. And there were some significant gains out of just tuning the transmission. We don't necessarily even have to add power and torque to that truck, but making some simple changes in the way the transmission strategy works when you're towing can be the difference between it lugging and not catching the gear when it should, to being able to maintain speed without the EGTs creeping up and get over that grade without even slowing down, So there were some advantages in changing some of the 10-speed stuff, and knowing that we're trying to crack into the 2022 ECM, which means the 23, 24 ECM stuff is coming as well. So there are some things that we can fix in those trucks that we think make them drive and tow better. The OE has to try and cater to a very broad audience and very broad drivability. Some of those guys aren't using those trucks for towing at all. You know what I mean? So we can kind of fine tune our calibrations for a specific user scenario, knowing that you're towing your trailer. We build our tow files and the trans strategies specifically for that. Whereas, our performance or extreme files may have a different trans strategy specific on how you're going to use the truck. You know what I mean? So
is it very similar with the Duramax and the 10-speed as far as being able to increase that drivability or improve it, or what things would you say when you jump behind one of those and you drive it and you think, I don't really like this, but we can change it?
Yeah, on the Duramax side of things, the 10-speed is pretty similar to the Ford. I think Ford did a better job of setting their factory trans strategies up. The GM seems to have a little more of a hunting feeling, like it's not sure which gear it wants to be in. So there's a little more hesitation. GM also baked in some pretty significant pedal lag. So there's a lot of delay in the pedal in that GM that I don't particularly care for. So those are all things that we tried to fine tune. We've got our Evolution CTS3 for the 20 to 23 L5P as well. And that does the engine and the trans tuning as well. Our big thing was when that 10-speed came out, in the earlier L5P, the 17 to 19 truck, we were able to add some pretty significant power to that truck. And the 6-speed transmission held it pretty well. We were able to get like 130 horsepower over stock, and that 17 to 19 truck handled it really well. But when the 2020 truck came out, we were able to get those same kind of gains, 120 to 130 horsepower. But that 10-speed trans just didn't want anything to do with it. It got really confused. It didn't know what to do. You make a wide open throttle pull with that added power, and it just didn't know what to do. And we were having issues with converter lockup and converter slippage. And so we had got to a point where we weren't quite willing to release all that power until we knew we could harness it with the transmission. So it took us a little bit longer to get the Evolution to the market because we didn't have trans support yet. We hadn't figured out how to unlock and flash that TCM. And until we had that, we weren't willing to get all of that engine tuning out there for it. So we kept working at it and reverse engineered and figured out how to get that 10-speed trans tuning into the vehicle. And we were the first to release 10-speed trans support on the market. And once we had that transmission stuff, we could increase some line pressures, make some changes to the converter lockup strategies, and we were able to actually transfer all of that power to the ground. And it improved the way that truck drove drastically. And that goes into the same thing with like that pedal control, being able to adjust that pedal lag. We give the user the ability to adjust that how they want it to feel. Some guys want the pedal to be really touchy. Some guys don't. And so, a lot of our devices give you that adjustability to set it where you want. You can kind of fine tune the driving experience yourself. So those were some of the big things on the L5P platform. But then, moving on to the late model Cummins, we kind of already touched on some of that. They just don't feel like they accelerate as strong. as the other trucks. They don't make quite as much power as the L5P or the Powerstroke does. Obviously, Cummins is making some big changes in their 2025 model truck, so we're excited to see how that changes things. But when we're testing these trucks and testing factory calibrations on our dyno, or we're doing our tow testing, we're lucky enough that our main headquarters is here in Ogden, Utah, where we live at elevation, and we're less than a 30-minute drive from some pretty significant mountain passes. And so we can hook up to a big trailer and go and do a bunch of torture testing, and we can test these trucks stock, and we can test them tuned, and we can watch EGTs and soot accumulation and regen frequency and all these key parameters, and kind of see where the gains can be had, and what we can do with the factory platforms. And that Cummins, it doesn't make quite the power the other two do, but they are an incredible machine for towing. You know what I mean? That Cummins motor and that transmission, and just the way those trucks are built, they handle the weight really well. And they handle the grades really well too. So being able to just increase some of that mid-range torque, and improve that feel from the driver's seat. There's a couple of features we have that we've been able to unlock in that Cummins. We have a remember last setting feature in our EZX that will remember your tow haul and the exhaust brake feature. So when you shut the truck off, that Dodge will normally just, when you refire the engine, go back through another key cycle. You have to go back and re-engage tow haul or re-engage your exhaust brake. And our module will just remember whatever setting you were in. So if you're a guy that prefers to daily drive in tow haul because you like the earlier converter lockup and the different shift strategy, the module will remember that you just run around in tow haul and just leave it in tow haul all the time.
That's
so you
cool.
don't have to, something you don't have to think about in the future. You know what I mean? So those are some of the deals that we kind of found in the Cummins that has been a really nice addition to the way those trucks drive.
Common question we get from you guys a lot is, hey, I need a diesel engine. I either, I can't wait this long to get one, or normal place I get stuff from it just takes too long, or they don't have the parts in it that I need. Maybe my truck's not stock, or I tow heavy with it. I don't want to go back with just a stock engine. DFC Diesel is a sponsor of the podcast. We worked with them, hand in hand on doing episodes, answering technical questions. They have a complete lineup of Cummins, Duramax, and Powerstroke remanufactured engines that are set to a standard of ISO 9001 2015 standards, which is a huge deal in the aftermarket. And there's certain levels of quality testing, validation that are required for that. So when you get one of those engines, the type of quality that's built behind it, with an industry-leading warranty that's really comprehensive. And the other thing with that is, sometimes the options that are out there, it's a basic OEM engine. You want a little bit more. You don't want to have the same failure again. So there's a bunch of different series of engines that they have, from core, street, tow haul, and also the Speed of Air series, which we've covered on the podcast before. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And if you have questions about that, reach out to them. If you don't know the type of engine that you're looking for, if you go to dfcdiesel.com, there's a ton of info there. You can send an email or you can reach out to them. Also, they're working with Speed of Air pistons, which it's the only piston that pays for itself. And there's a lot of really cool technology behind it. So you can add that into your build and be able to get better fuel economy, increase power, increase torque, and better engine life out of it. Some of the most common engine applications or series of engines that they have with that lead time, a lot of them are in stock or they have really short lead times. So you can check your favorite retailer or go to dfcdiesel.com, check them out, see what's in stock, see what you can get. If you have questions, maybe you want to do something that's outside of the normal series of engines, they have tons of choices for rods, cranks, pistons, valve train upgrades, tons of different things. So if you're in the market, definitely make sure and head on over and check them out. And well, the couple things you mentioned there kind of segue into the R&D part that I mentioned earlier. In, like we hear about dyno testing, tow testing, things like that. What does that really mean? Because I don't think we know. I don't know. I don't know if how many hours are spent on a dyno. I don't know how many miles are put on with, a truck, say with the L5P that you mentioned, and wanting to get into the transmission and change some things with it. Are there hundreds of miles put on, thousands? Like what goes into the torture testing that you mentioned?
Yeah, it really kind of depends on the platform. But we purchase new trucks when they come out. We've got a full fleet of vehicles that are company owned, that we do all of this development on. And then we're also blessed that we've got a bunch of our engineers and a bunch of our employees that are also enthusiasts. They're truck guys that go camping with their families on the weekend, or they like to go to the sand dunes, and they're towing their enclosed trailers with their 4-seater turbo side by sides. You know what I mean? We live close to a couple different sand dunes, but there's some pretty big grades between us and the St. Anthony dunes and up in Idaho. And we've got some great sand dunes that are south of us and get down into the St. George area. And Moab's not too far. We've got some of our engineers, they're off-road guys that have Jeeps. And so we use our company vehicles, our fleet vehicles, or their personally owned vehicles for that development and testing. And it kind of depends on, each application is different. The L5P, I would say we put thousands of miles on the L5P when we were developing the Pulsar V3. We had that truck for almost 3 years before we released flash tuning, because it took that long of time to figure out how to reverse engineer those locked ECMs, figure out how we could get in and start flashing them, and then get our CTS3 platform to be able to read and flash that ECM or the TCMs through the unlock process. So there was a lot of time spent on that L5P platform before we released anything to the market. So it kind of depends on the truck and the application, but we could spend anywhere from 100 hours to 1,000 hours behind the seat, towing stock, towing with it tuned, adjusting the calibrations. We might create a calibration on the chassis dyno that makes a really good number. We're seeing good peak power gains. We're seeing good max power gains. The torque curve looks nice, and you go hook it up to the trailer, and we get halfway up the grade and it triggers a check engine light. And there was something that wasn't happy once it was under load, once the intake air temperature started to increase. Once you get to a situation where the charge temps start to increase, the engine doesn't like it. You know what I mean? So developing a tune on the dyno is not the same as using it out on the road and how you're going to use the truck. So we have the ability to test all of that in all of those scenarios. And, we'll get out on the highway and set the cruise control and just drive and collect that data. You know what I mean? So our engineers spend a lot of time in the seat testing these trucks. And it's tough because the end consumer is always chomping at the bit. You know what I mean? When a new truck comes out, they're already ready. They've had the truck for 2 weeks and they're ready to tune it. They're ready for something. You know what I mean? When's it going to be available? But like we mentioned, that L5P platform that came out in 2017, it took quite a while before there was tuning support for it. And we're in that same situation now with like the 23 and newer Ford Super Duties. We had our EasyX module for the 2022. And in 2023, Ford changed a lot of stuff in their modules. And it meant we had to go back to the drawing board and do some reverse engineering. And the 2024 models are out, and we still don't have support for the 2023. But we've got a 2023 that's in the dyno bay right now. We're working on those calibrations and adding as many features into the module as we possibly can that the end user will be able to have some control over. And sometimes, as the OEs get smarter, it means it makes our job tougher. So sometimes getting to market isn't as easy as just turning the rail pressure up and sending you on your way. You know what I mean?
But as a truck owner, that's what I want. Like, I would rather wait and be impatient and, be checking for updates all the time than beta testing on my own truck that costs 6 figures or I'm making a payment on or something like that.
Yeah. And we're mindful to that. There are some applications that we don't have support for, tuning support for, that we want to. But we know we don't have the technology to do it as safely or as efficiently as we want to. And so there are some situations where there'll be a competitor that beats us to the market. We've got some competitors in a few of these new truck markets that have a product available and they're selling them and marketing them, and we don't yet. And so, we try and do our due diligence. We'll order one of those competitive products and test it ourselves. In a recent situation, we had a competitor that beat us to the market with some L5P stuff, and we wanted to see, how did they get to the market so much quicker? And once we got the device and realized what they were doing with it, and we found that they actually had tapped into some of the wrong locations. They weren't getting data that they thought they were getting. And because of that, they're sending regen status basically through the roof. They're not getting the information they think they are. And so they're just turning up the fuel, and in a DPF equipped vehicle, turning up the fuel isn't always the answer. There's more that has to go into that. And so, it's a fine line of, what can we do and how quick can we get to the market, and how confident are we that our consumers are going to be happy with the product and that they're not going to have any issues with it long term. You know what I mean? So we've had some situations like our EZ module for the 24 L5P. We were able to make quite a bit of horsepower with that module, just plugging in under the hood, piggybacking some of the sensors under the hood and manipulating the calibrations. But at a certain point, we saw there was some diminishing returns. To make 80 horsepower, these were the results we were getting in soot accumulation and EGR flow, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was a little more than we really wanted to see. So we turn it down, and we released that product with 65 horsepower gains instead of 80 horsepower gains, because long term we were happier with the end results. You know what I mean? Can we make more power? Sure. Is that going to lead to more issues in 50,000 miles? Possibly. You know what I mean? So we'd rather err on the safe side. And that's kind of how we go into every project. So
I was going to ask that next about the temptation that is probably there, because people, when they're, looking for a product, we look for the peak. Well, I don't even know if most of us think of peak. We just look for what the power number is. It adds 143, adds 175, whatever it might be. And we think, well, that's best. And the temptation might be there to say, okay, well, we'll make 178 or we'll make 147. So it's a little bit more. But you touched on this in our last podcast about usable power. And maybe, that peak number at this high RPM where you're really not spending a lot of time might not be worth it. And there could also be a downside to it. What's the best way for us to think about that? Because it's something I fall into as well. I look at, peak performance, peak fuel economy, and this isn't just tuning. We can see this across the board in the aftermarket. How can we understand better what that power is doing, what it's giving us through not just the dyno, but also on like the road testing that you talked about? Because I think that's a crucial point. They kind of come together, and you have that real world drivability versus this peak number that might have been on a dyno, somewhere. I might not see that. So I think that's a key part.
Yeah. And a lot of that goes into the way that it's marketed. There's lots of guys that will market based off of their peak horsepower gains. There's guys that will market off of their max horsepower gains. Those are two very different numbers. You know what I mean? What were the gains? The peak horsepower is the point in the RPM curve where that engine makes the most power. And some guys will market what their gains are at that RPM range. How much horsepower do we gain at that peak RPM? But then you'll also see max gains. And there's a situation, that's how much horsepower do we gain in the RPM range, wherever the biggest number gain was in the RPM range. It might not be the peak, but, like our L5P, we did some calibration testing on the dyno. We got one of our competitors' calibrations. One of the custom tuners, we've got some calibrations from one of those guys and tested in our 21 L5P. And peak to peak, we made almost identical horsepower. I mean, we were within like 5 horsepower of each other at the peak RPM. But down low at, say, 2200 RPM, our Evolution had 80 horsepower more than that competitor's tune. So, I mean, we can market peak gains and be just as competitive as they are, or vice versa. But the max gains down low were drastically different. And that's something that you feel on the street. That's something you feel when you're towing. How is that power curve throughout the RPM range? How does it feel on the street? You go out and drive that truck with the two different tunes, and they feel drastically different. You can absolutely tell which one is making more power down low and how it accelerates through the gears, But that is something that's hard to convey to the average consumer. You know what I mean? The peak gains aren't always what wins in drivability, and how we apply that power through the transmission and like we talked earlier, how the transmission transfers that power can make a difference. If we throw a bunch of power at something and the transmission doesn't know what to do with it, you're going to feel that. All that power on the dyno, we're making one pull through one gear with a converter locked in a 1-to-1 ratio. And what you see on a dyno chart doesn't necessarily mean that you'll feel it on the street. So making sure we keep that torque curve nice and wide and broad, and the power doesn't fall off too much, or the torque doesn't fall off as the RPMs go up too far. How we apply that power and use it on the street is very important. And all of it has to work well together. And then we also have to take into the consideration of all the emissions and the DPF and the soot and all that, the EGR flow, all that stuff plays a vital role in how those calibrations are built. So marketing it definitely becomes a challenge. There's a lot of places that want to tell you the story that they want you to hear, because that's what helps sells products. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. You know what I mean? So we try to market with as open and as honest as information as we can give the consumer. We're not normally a brand that knocks a competitor's product. We don't try to sell our products based off of the pitfalls of the competitors' products. We like to sell our products marketing the advantages to our own. You know what I mean? But it is a hard message to get to the consumer, that the horsepower number doesn't mean everything. So it's definitely a challenge in today's space. But the diesel consumer, some of those are, every market is a little bit different. One of our sister brands, Diablo Sport, that does a lot of tuning in the gas space. They do a lot of tuning in the modern muscle space, the Chargers and Challengers and Hellcats and Camaros and that kind of stuff. And to the consumers in those cars, quarter mile times mean everything. Some of those guys, it's cool to say my Hellcat makes 750 horsepower, but a lot of those guys are more intrigued by what the car does at the quarter mile. Can they prove it's faster? You know what I mean? That's not necessarily the case for our diesel owners. They don't necessarily care that their 1-ton dually can run a half a second faster than the quarter mile. But if they can maintain 75 miles an hour on cruise control with their fifth wheel gooseneck trailer loaded down with 10 bales a ton hay, that's what they're curious about. How can they help their fuel mileage when they're towing trailers? You know what I mean? Those are the kind of things that we look for, and we try to cater to and make sure that we can do better than stock.
Yeah, I think on these newer trucks, they look towards the emissions system, say the DPF, or just the engine life in general. That's really the reason they bought that diesel truck, was for the torque, the power, and the longevity. And I think you've answered this question. Well, I know you've answered this question during this podcast, but I think this will bring it together really well for me to ask it. Is what's the longevity like versus stock on a DPF or an engine, stock versus tuned? If I was to just say the answer, I think it is because of the emissions testing and the results and the certification and things you guys go through to make the tuning, it's not going to load that DPF any more than what would be acceptable to EPA testing or carb testing. And then likewise with the engine, you're operating within those parameters as well, with the safeguards that exist in the OEM software, or even you guys might go above and beyond that with the product to be able to ensure that. I think I'm on the right track, but I wanted to ask you that.
It's always a bit of a loaded question, because soot accumulation, regen frequency, all of that can vary drastically from one tank of fuel to the next, depending on how you're driving the truck, how heavy your foot is. If you're running one of our a big horsepower tune and you have the throttle sensitivity cranked all the way up, obviously you're getting a little more fuel tip in down low. You know what I mean? So the way you drive it can drastically affect regen frequency, regen status, DPF on and off stuff, miles between regens. That a lot of that can be very different. And that's the same in a stock application, even when they're not tuned. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're going to use more urea. You're going to use more DEF when you're towing than when you're not towing, because the engine's working harder. It's under a load. You're using more throttle to do the same amount of work. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a loaded question. to say that, tuning won't change that at all. With that said, our company, we've got our in-house emissions cell that's got all of the state-of-the-art emissions testing equipment. So we can go through all of the same tests that CARB tests with. And we can test these vehicles in a stock form, and we can test these vehicles with our calibrations. And we always choose the tune that should be the worst case scenario. This is the tune that should be the dirtiest, for lack of a better term. And if we stay within, CARB's parameters and the testing parameters for that emissions output, then we can feel confident that the systems aren't going to have any additional issues. We can feel confident that these tunes are going out onto the street and they're going to run and perform really well, and they're going to burn clean and efficient. And a lot of it just depends on the situations that the driver puts the truck into. And there's so many things that can affect that. Dirty fuel filters versus clean fuel filters, dirty air filter, running at elevation. I mean, even simple things as like the ambient air temperature. My personal 17 Ford, I can watch the soot accumulation. It's very different in the winter versus in the summer. You know what I mean? So all of those things go into that. And so it's hard to say that we don't affect that in any way, shape, or form, because it can be very different depending on so many factors. But I do know that we are doing more emissions testing and more emissions data collection than any of the competitors in the space. We're going above and beyond what the current regulations are with our aftermarket calibrations in the emissions compliance realm, that we're confident that what we're putting out on the market is clean, and that the owners of those trucks are going to be happy with the way the vehicles perform for a really long time. So it's a tough conversation to have, because there's still downfalls with the factory emissions equipment. They're still having issues. The late model Duramaxes have problems with the urea tanks and the heaters failing, and so it's the factory equipment can still fail at any time, whether they're tuned or they're not tuned. So it's hard to say, pinpoint a specific problem that led to the early demise of a vehicle, you know what I mean, or an engine or an EGR valve or whatever. But it has definitely improved over the last 5 to 10 years. All that emissions equipment has gotten much better, to the point that in a lot of these newer trucks, we can make the same kind of power tuned with the emissions equipment installed as you can tuned with the emissions equipment removed. You know what I mean? That there's definitely something to be said to how well these trucks perform without affecting the emissions systems.
Yeah, they've definitely come a long way from 2007 and a half, 2008 to now, and what you're able to do. So it's a really interesting space with these newer kind of year ranges, like we were talking about with the different brands, is the power you can make, the torque you can make. I mean, stock, they're great, but we always want more. We always need a little bit more. And we think back to, what did a 94 12 valve come with? What did a 7.3 OBS come with? What did, a 6.5, or, even an LB7, when it was revolutionary in 2001 to have a common rail injection to where they are now. It's a huge change. And that definitely answers the questions that I've seen from some listeners that want to tow, need to tow, have to tow, but they want a little bit more power, and they want to make sure what they're getting is safe, or it's tested. There is data behind it. And I think that was a really good insight that you gave us into how it works at Edge, with not just the chassis dyno and peak or max numbers, but what it is real world towing up a mountain, or off-roading, or all these different conditions, so that when you put it on your truck, like I said, you're not the beta tester. It's already been done for thousands of miles, and there's data to back it up. So it gives people that confidence when they add power to an expensive truck, that a lot of time and effort's been put into it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Edge has been around since 1999, and it's going to be around for a long time yet to come. You know what I mean? So it's definitely not a fly-by-night operation. You know what I mean? There's a lot of time and money invested in to what we do and the products that we release, and we're always trying to evolve and improve what we've put out in the past. You know what I mean? You mentioned the second gen applications early on in the podcast, and that's kind of what put Edge on the map was the VP44 market. That's where Edge really got their start, was doing performance modules for those trucks 20 some odd years ago. And we're still offering those products for those trucks today. But 2 years ago, we were presented with an opportunity to do something different for that platform. Our comp module that we'd been offering since 2001 was still on the market 2 years ago. It'd been on the market for 20 years and was basically untouched. And it came to the point where we had to discontinue that product because we couldn't get the parts to build them anymore. Everything had become obsolete. And so we went back to the drawing boards and, is this a market we still see a future in? Can we reinvest in that market? Can we put some more engineering effort into that platform and see some return on that investment? Or do we just discontinue it, sunset it, and just watch it fade off into the distance? There's still a lot of market for those VP44 trucks. There's still a lot of them out on the road. There's still a lot of guys that want to keep driving them, fixing them up, so we decided to jump right back into it. We had the advantage that our original engineer from that module in 2001 still works here and was one of the lead engineers on our new EasyX platform. So we were able to use his knowledge of the VP44 from 20 years ago and what we've learned with our new technology and kind of morph those into a new product. So we released our new version of the comp that now has smartphone control. And in doing so, we were able to find more fueling and more RPM than what they had available 20 years ago. The new technology untapped some other features in that truck. And then it also allowed us to go back to the drawing boards with the emissions. The emissions control isn't necessarily something that's a concern on those older trucks. They didn't have catalytic converters. They didn't have DPFs, you know what I mean? But emissions compliance is still something we feel strongly about. So when we developed the new comp, we still ran it through our emissions test cell to make sure it was still going to meet emission standards. And we found a few things that we had to go back to the drawing boards. So in that specific product, we implemented a feature that's called cold engine protection. That's not something the original comp box ever had. And some of our original devices from 15 years ago didn't have something like that. So you go out to your truck on a cold morning and start it up. If your module's in level 5, you're going to get level 5 fueling right off the get-go. But we also know that that's when most of the emissions are put out of these trucks, is when their engines are cold, And so we were able to implement a new feature into that box that doesn't allow it to go to that level 5 full fueling until it gets up to a safe operating temp, which was done for emissions control. But there's also some engine safety built into that too. Yeah. If you go out there with a whole bunch of timing and fueling on a cold engine, it'd be pretty easy to pop a head gasket. You know what I mean? So we have the technology to kind of pull that power in slow and make sure that the engine's up to operating temp and is going to be safe with that added power and torque. So, we're always trying to evolve and make something better than we used to. Definitely make something better than the competitor.
It was interesting. Earlier today, I was doing a podcast with the founder of Stainless Diesel, and we're talking about second gen trucks and like what to look for if you buy one, because that's it was a huge part of Stainless Diesel for a long time. It still is. And we were going through different things, and he said, man, those turbo timers that Edge had, like, that is so important. And they build turbos, so they see bearings that are worn and other things. And he was talking about the importance, not just with second gens, but even up to the VGT stuff and 6.7s, is being able to let them cool off before you turn them off. And then, we were going to chat today and kind of connected the two, really well, are those kind of safety features, those things that are built in that we should know better. We should know to let it sit there and idle for a few minutes and turn it off. But, sometimes we don't. And being able to avoid, bearing wear and having to get a turbo is important. And all the things you went through with us with the DPF and the transmissions and all that, it definitely helps, answer some questions we've had from listeners. And you guys' website is really great. And I always like to be able to, for people who have questions, they want to learn more, maybe they want to ask something really specific, the best place to be able to connect with you guys, is that jumping on the website, social media, email, phone call? What's the best way?
So obviously our website's a great place to get product information and vehicle information and what our different products can do for the specific vehicle. But if you have specific questions about some of that stuff, our tech support line, we've got 2 different locations with a bunch of customer tech support guys that we try to keep trained up. We have a little bit of a turnover in that tech room, but we've got a bunch of techs here in our Ogden location. We've got a bunch of techs in our Sanford, Florida location. Those guys are always willing to answer questions. Obviously, we've got our social media channels. We're biggest on Facebook and Instagram. If a listener has specific questions about a product or their truck and what product is going to be best for their application, they can always reach out to us with a message on any of those platforms. But the website is definitely a great place to get product feature information. But if they have a question, what are safe EGTs, or what are some things that I should be watching on my monitor, on my Insight? We have a YouTube channel with a bunch of different how-tos. This year, we're going to branch off and start doing a weekly video that we're going to post up on our social media channels that are kind of like how-tos. And, the CTS3 platform can do so many things. We know that the consumers are underutilizing the technology that's in that monitor on the dash. So we're going to start doing a weekly series to show you, hey, this is a feature in your Insight, and this is how you set it up, and this is why it is something that would be important. So that's something we're going to try and do, expand on this year, and try and raise some of that awareness, general awareness of your diesel pickup, get more interactive with our consumers that way.
Very cool. Well, it was awesome chatting today with you, Jacob. I always appreciate your time and expertise, and you get a bunch of our listener questions answered, and then you help me understand these new trucks better. I don't have a brand new one, so a lot of the stuff I'm curious about, learning along, just with everybody else out there. So it's really, really cool to chat with you. I look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, you bet. I think thanks for the reach out. I'm glad to be able to do it again, and we'll make sure to come around next time.
Don't forget, diesel fans, make sure and head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 25TDP40. Get you 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear. If you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house, they've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, different handle designs, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet a wide variety of budgets. So if you're in the market, head on over to their website. Use code 25TDP40. Get 40% off MSRP. Also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters, Tyler Loewen of 23 Diesel, CUTTERUP Rob, Robert, all of our other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube, podcast apps, follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 9 of the Diesel Podcast, and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2025. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.